Well, a very good afternoon and a warm welcome to Pat Komafani Conversations. As you know, on a Saturday afternoon, the program that we enjoy listening to, learning from, is Faith Heroes, where we get to know more about God through various Bible characters. And this is where we really get to see how infinite God through this program and through the Bible characters who we call the faith heroes. Some of them are named in the Bible, but some of them are not named in the Bible. But we get deeper and deeper and get to know, God's purpose about us reading about those Bible characters, and also that we get to get, the diverse interpretations from the panelists, and also, the various applications, so that whatever we learn Bible character, be it David, be it Samson, be it Ruth, be it Esther, be it John, whoever it is, whatever we get to learn about that particular Bible character, wona mbuzo esiye sizibuze wona ngumbuzo othi, if then that was God's purpose in the Bible character, what is he telling us about who he is? Yena uThixo. And it's great. Then this afternoon, I have to tell you, probably you've seen this in the poster already, that we're discussing Nehemiah today. Okay, uNehemiah. Bana baninzi xa kumentionwa igama likaNehemiah bacinga indonga zase Jerusalem. Let me bring the panel in so you get to meet the panel, and God is going to lead the discussions and the conversation today. Okay, so that at the end of it all, we may become better people because of the kind of engaging that will be shown today. Pastor Mapumulo, Jabu Mapumulo, Umashimani, the producer, is here as usual. Ngwenya, it's good to have you again this lovely Saturday afternoon, and great to have you, particularly with Nehemiah.
Yes, good afternoon, Ngwenya. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to our listeners. This is my favorite afternoon hour. Every Sabbath, to be here and just sit at the feet of Jesus and learn practical things that all of us can apply in our day-to-day life. So I'm looking forward to discuss Nehemiah today.
Lovely, lovely. Well, he is our script developer, Pastor Mapumulo, and it's great to have him every Saturday. Bishop Joshua Maponga Marara, he is our panelist also this afternoon. Bishop Maponga, it's good to have you. Hlathi siyavula ke ngokuba ukhona nawe today apha kule discussion go Nehemiah, and Pastor Xhamela Umbui is still on the road from the airport, but she'll be joining us soon. But guess what? Surprise, surprise, our special guest, Bishop Andile Mbete, Ibele Elihle Umkozwam. Because it's good to have you also on the show today as we discuss Nehemiah. Wow, thank you for agreeing at short notice. Uguti, ube part of the panel namhlanje.
Kulela kakhulu sisa umuntu ngegama lenkosi. Nehemiah was a great leader, and their lessons.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, I'm going to go back to Pastor Mapumulo. Mashimane, as the producer, I would love to ask you, sort of give us a bit of an intro, who Nehemiah was. And why are we looking at Nehemiah today? We had 3 great episodes of the man called Job. There was even Job part 1, Job part 2, Job part 3. But here we are today with Nehemiah. Just tell us, Ubani Nehemiah, and why are we looking at Nehemiah? What characteristics were there? Just in a nutshell, what kind of a leader, so that then the panelists can take it further, and then let's see how we can become better people and better Christians through this wonderful faith hero, Nehemiah. Over to you, Ngwenya.
Well, thank you very much, Ngwenya. Look, there are a lot of things we can talk about Nehemiah, but look at the principal thing that sets Nehemiah aside is his leadership. And we'll talk about that today. Now, you will recall that Israel had been in Babylon for 70 years. And after that 70 years, they had come home. Of course, there are others who were left in Babylon. So therefore, the book of Nehemiah is what we call a post-exilic book, post-after-exilic exile. So this is the book that focuses on the life after exile. But it's not the only book. There are three of them, actually. You have Ezra, you have Nehemiah, and you also have Esther. And Ezra, the name Ezra means helper. The name Nehemiah means a comforter from God. And then the name Esther comes from the Hebrew word, which means, amongst other things, which means hidden. Now, if you look at these books, three books, they're actually related to each other. So Ezra's mandate was to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah's mandate was to rebuild the walls in Jerusalem, the capital city, the seat of government, and the place where decisions are taken. So when you look at this life of Nehemiah, and he comes into the picture. So he has this mandate to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild Jerusalem. But Nehemiah is confronted by three things when he gets back home to Jerusalem. There are two serious problems with Israel. Number one, Israel is engulfed with a sin of materialism. Now, if you read Nehemiah chapter 10, verses 31 to 39, and if you read also chapter 13, verses 15 to 22, there are at least three things that Israel was engulfed in, which I call them sin of materialism. One is that they had stopped taking care of the temple. So in other words, they neglected their duty. Number two, they withheld their tithes and offering. And number three, they even went to the extent of breaking the Sabbath. So that's the first one, the sin of materialism. So Nehemiah finds people with this type of mindset. He has a mandate that is totally opposite to what they were thinking in their mind. The second sin, that problem that Israel was facing when Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem, of course, is that Israel had lost a sense of vision for the larger mission. And this is important. And it's significant also for us today, because any organization or any church that loses its vision will never accomplish its mission. And so this is where Israel was, because by the fact that they had neglected the temple, they had withheld their tithe and offering, they were even breaking the Sabbath, was an indicator that they had lost the larger mission that they should have had where they were. And of course, the third problem that they were faced is that Israel was faced with a very serious problem, which we can see today the world over. And what this problem is, that it's a lack of spiritual leadership. Now, this is a very rare commodity in organizations, in churches today. Because if you read Nehemiah chapter 13, the first 11 verses, the Bible speaks up, because Nehemiah himself spoke of leaders who had problems with stewardship and who led people towards an inward focused or self-serving religion. Now Nehemiah then must come and face and deal with this type of mindset in Israel, and which I said the sin of materialism, the loss of a sense of vision of the larger mission, and thirdly, the lack of spiritual leadership. Now, any organization that is faced with these three, I can tell you now, is doomed for failure. And the same thought is applicable to an individual, because I don't want you to think that, well, at least this is organizational. Look, it's also individual, because as a person, you're always faced with this temptation of materialism, and because you have lost a sense of vision of your larger mission. You know, remember when we were created, God said to Adam and Eve that they must go and have dominion over all the creatures that God had created. So if you lose the sense of what you were born to do or to be, of the impact you are supposed to have in your immediate environment, in your workplace, in your school, in your community, if you lose that, I can tell you now, you're going to be circling around life, achieving nothing. And so if also you are lacking spirituality in your life, then you have a serious problem to get to where you need to go. Now, the question we're asking today is, what is it that was so remarkable about Nehemiah's leadership style that was able now to deal with all of these things that I've mentioned and move Israel forward? What was it with Nehemiah's management style that made him to be outstanding till today? Because Nehemiah is an embodiment of what great leadership is. And so these are the things that we like to talk about.
I think Sure. I think Pastor Mapumulo, you've given a very great picture of how the people were when Nehemiah was, if I may borrow a term in today's civic society, when he was deployed to sort of correct what was not going right with the children of Israel, and the neglect and the neglect of the temple, the neglect of the walls of Jerusalem. I just want to bring in Bishop Mbete. Nehemiah comes to an environment, Bele, which is not desirable of the children of God, but he comes in as a great leader. And you said also when you were greeting us that he's a great leader. I am interested in the qualities and traits or characteristics of this kind of leader that Nehemiah was. Bishop Mbete?
Thank you very much. I think the first thing that is a good lesson from Nehemiah, bear in mind that he was in a creative position in exile. He was a cupbearer. He was close to power. He could have resisted the call to go back home, but because he was a great leader, he saw that the call from God was bigger than the privileges that he was enjoying in exile. For me is critical, and he also knew that he could be rejected by those who were inside because he had been living outside. I also want to emphasize that it's critical to learn from this book that although we should always try to separate spirituality from politics or places of power, his position helped him because he got letters that helped him to go to any of the neighboring countries, and even getting the permission to cut down trees to repair the temple of God. It is also very important to see, I think, in verse 5 of chapter 1, that when the king asked Nehemiah what he wanted, Nehemiah's number one priority was prayer.
Yeah.
Prayed. He did not just got excited because he was in conversation with the king. He knew that there was a king that is powerful than this king. He asked for wisdom. It is also very important to note that what we must learn as individuals, as the church, but also as a nation, is that Nehemiah realized that although the problem of the Jews was at the surface more of a physical nature, indonga ziwile, negates zitshile, he knew that underlining everything else was the spiritual state of things. I think Pastor Mapumulo towards that, they had neglected the temple, they had neglected the Sabbath, they had neglected tithing. So while we may see that we want to fix things that are of physical nature, we should never ever lose sight that underlining corruption, moral decay is the spiritual state of things.
Yes. Yes.
And my last point at this time is that I salute him. This is now Nehemiah for understanding leadership as assigning tasks. When you come to that part, when there was rebuilding of gates and that, he allocated responsibilities, and that is a good lesson, that you may be called and you may be spiritually endowed, but you cannot do everything yourself.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Thank you, Bishop. And there's a point that you've made here, that it doesn't matter how tasked we are with sorting out materialistic or physical things, or the state of decay in physical or social, and if I may stretch it further, even political, but we must always go back to one fundamental question. What is the spiritual dipstick of these people? And from the panel, I pick that up. Application wise, we may need to revisit that about the world today and COVID-19 and all and of that. What are the bishops? What are the leaders? What is the clergy doing in terms of determining the spiritual dipstick of our nation? For no COVID-19 and all of that. Is the clergy taking after Nehemiah? Later on, we will come to that. I want to bring in Bishop Maponga at this moment. Marara, I want to bring you in and just take us through your understanding and interpretation of the situation as we see this great faith hero and Bible character, Nehemiah. You find things in disorder. And Bishop Mbete has said that first and foremost, he prayed to God. What kind of man are you seeing in Nehemiah, Bishop Maponga, and what we also ought to be, perhaps because of his influence and inspiration?
As you rightfully suggested, that maybe it would be prudent to break the conversation into a number of presentations so that maybe people can more thoroughly and exhaustively look at the life leadership models, political environment, economic support, the working together of church and state, the whole idea of oppression, slavery, repatriation, and principles that will guide the present generation in terms of mapping a way going forward. However, I need to just mention 2 points in my introduction. Number one, it is the usage of what I call biblical literature or classic literature or inspirational or wisdom literature, which is the Bible and many other sources that people may find out there that are spiritual. We need to identify, firstly, an audience. And after identifying an audience, then you will take the text and then parallel it to the audience so that relevance and meaning is not locked in the post-exilic era of the Jewish history, but it is extrapolated into the modern generation, even as South Africa and many other countries are always talking about we who are coming from exile, we who are coming from exile. You cannot miss even the political conversation in our modern generation as reference to the book of Nehemiah. As such, it is therefore important to maybe give you a small little, what I might call a template, which I will use for today to guide me in my conversation. Firstly, it is what I want to call personal interpretation. How does the book of Nehemiah speak to an individual? How does this book address you as an individual? And secondly, it could be how does this book address you as a family? And thirdly, it could be how does it address you as a community or as a nation? Then you would find that the lessons begin to magnify themselves towards application. And therefore, the life of Nehemiah is the life of the Africans themselves. The question is not whether we are Jews or Hebrews, but the moral of the story is how far have we been moved away from home? How long have we been in exile? What is the strategy of return? Do we have leadership to navigate us back to our original home and place of birth? Having said that, I will need to further extend the story of Nehemiah in terms of chronological positioning of the book of Nehemiah. The book of, I will skip quite a number of content for time purposes. The book of Isaiah and Jeremiah become precursors. After Nehemiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel and Daniel are parallel. They are working together. If you know the history in the book of Daniel, the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, and then the Greeks and following such, then you will find that the story of Nehemiah, Ezra, and Esther, and parts of the book of Kings, they don't belong where they are in the Bible, which is a few pages backwards. We needed to go back to the book of Nehemiah and some parts of the book of Kings and some parts of the book of, actually the whole book of Ezra and the whole book of Esther, and then put them between the book of Jeremiah, after the book of Jeremiah, Then the storyline begins to make sense because you are dealing with Artaxerxes, Cyrus, and Darius, who are the kings who are running with Nehemiah. But when you read the history chronologically, you may find these characters in the past chapters. So maybe we might need, as modern scholars, I'm challenging my bishops on the line, that we may want to rewrite what I might want to call a chronological Bible, so that for those who have not privileged enough to go through school.
Bishop Maponga, I need to come in. I'm sorry, I need to come in. I need to come in, Bishop Maponga, at this moment and ask that we relook at your connection. We're losing very important and critical points that you are making because of connection issues. So your sound keeps breaking, and we may be losing. While you're attending to that, please attend to that for me, okay? And then we're going to bring him back, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome Pastor Xhamela. Let me welcome Pastor Xhamela. I would love that Bishop Maponga sorts out the connection there. Pastor Xhamela, you're finding us right at the beginning where we're looking at this great leader. And there seems to be consensus that Nehemiah was a great leader. We're going to bring you in, and then Bishop Maponga will work at his corner. What kind of, in your understanding and research as a pastor yourself, what kind of a leader, what made him to earn the respect and title that Nehemiah was a great leader? Can you hear me?
She is frozen.
Yeah, she's frozen. Frozen to take it forward. We're just waiting to improve the connection. Okay, Bishop Maponga is back. Bishop
Am I
Maponga.
audible now? Am
Yes,
I audible?
you are. I'm hoping that it's not going to break again.
Oh.
We cannot allow the devil to interfere with this broadcast. I've got some of the best panelists here.
No, you're good. You're good.
I'm good. What I was saying is, in the writing of the Bible, we needed therefore to be able to develop, and I'm challenging the bishops in the house who are strong enough to take the challenge, that we need to rewrite the Bible, not rewriting in terms of rewriting it, but we need to write a chronological Bible, so that those who don't have the privilege of having gone to school can actually be able to see the storyline, that it is the book of Daniel, then you'll have the book of, parts of the book of Kings, parts of the book of, all of the book of Nehemiah, all of the book of Ezra, then the book of Esther. Then chronologically reading, we can actually see the development of the passage itself. Having said that, Nehemiah becomes the forerunner in terms of the calling people back to their own land, calling people back to their own spirituality, calling people back to their own history, and you find that the walls are broken and everything else. And as I've always said, when you look at it from that angle, then you begin to understand the problem of the African. Which Babylon are we living in? Who are the leaders who must transport us back? What tools do they need to transport us back? What strategic partners can we forge with the state to take us back? And in understanding that concept, therefore, we're already discussing the story of and the relationship between the church and the state. We're also discussing the issue of materialism that you mentioned quite frankly, and Pastor Mapumulo did a good job when he mentioned actually that this must be a personal conversation, a family conversation, and Patko, you put it well, it must also become a national conversation as we are dealing with pandemics that are on the line. The question of leadership is that which is of critical importance. Political leadership, economic leadership, religious leadership, academic leadership. In all facets of life, what is lacking in the society today is a Nehemiah gene that can be able to move people away from Babylon to their land of birth. I thank you.
Okay, Wayne, are you there? Are you there?
Yeah, I was also trying to test my connectivity on my side as well, to change from Wi-Fi and sort of hotspot it. So yeah, okay. Bishop Maponga, you want to bring point to a particular part so the panelists can pull off certain feathers from your point. Can you hear me, Bishop Maponga?
Yes.
Yeah.
You were saying?
Okay. I was saying you built a very interesting case here of the chronology of the children of Israel in exile, and the fact that the story is scattered all over, back and forth, and it is one story: the children of Israel in exile. And I was enjoying that, and then I needed you to sort of land somewhere in Nehemiah so that the other panelists are able to sort of plug out certain points from what you were presenting? Or are you done with your first part now so I can bring in somebody else?
I could mention 2 or 3 plugs. I have actually run a crusade or 2 using the book of Nehemiah, building of the broken walls. Some of you might remember that sermon that I did. I also did a sermon entitled, I Cannot Come Down, I Am Carrying On a Great Work. And I also did a script entitled, Go and Tell Sanballat. I also did one of my favorites, let's spread away so that we can be far from each other. But whenever you hear the trumpet, meet me there. You know, beautiful passage right there. That also will be talking about the strategy of working. I also did another script that is entitled a shovel on one hand, a trowel on one hand, and a spear on the other hand. And I see in this book actually the strategy in which the African child must work. While we are trying to build this great continent, we have to be using a trowel on one side. We must be carrying our swords on the other side to protect ourselves. The enemies, those that have captured us, and our neighbors are laughing at what we are doing. But as it were, the book of Nehemiah, for me, is actually an African story, restoring people from Babylon and confusion and bringing us back to the land of our fathers. With that in mind, Nehemiah is not afraid of money. I also did a script entitled The Cupbearer. Some of you might remember that. The wine tester in the palace of the king. And that was Nehemiah himself. You know, the job of humility and etc. And doing small tasks that result with you being a great leader. So there are quite a number of themes that you would find, you know, stretching themselves across the book of Nehemiah. And any member, any family, and any country can actually learn from this book as we are talking and mobilizing people towards this great exodus. I thank you.
Love. Before I bring Bishop Mbete back, I just need to recognize the presence of Pastor Xhamela. Nguye yedwa ke imazi etsalane nkabi namhlanje, and let me bring in Pastor Xhamela on your understanding of things to learn from the book of Nehemiah, and from Nehemiah, the man himself, the leader that he was. Kazlam, please, kaungeneke magaba. Oh, okay. All right. Let me go back to Bishop Mbete. There's a dimension that is very interesting that Bishop Maponga was building here. And let me come back to you on this type of leader. And if we're really doing justice as the Christian community in terms of lessons to be learned from Nehemiah, Pelelihle?
Yes, thank you very much. Bishop Maponga should come back with this phenomenon as your African eyes and African ear. Let me just take one line. I studied this book and I went overseas and I studied it. And it was only when I used my African way of thinking that I understood why Nehemiah and where he got the news about the state of affairs at home. I realized that as an African, when you say to me, how are you? You don't say, I'm fine, thank you, and how are you? It becomes a... So when he met his countrymen, it could have been over the conversation on how are you that they talked about the state of their homeland. But coming back to the story itself, I have highlighted certain things. The other one that I love about him, which we should learn, is in chapter 2 from verse 12 on 13, when he did a quiet inspection, an assessment of the damage, because as Christians and as church, we sometimes, unlike Nehemiah, want to copy the world and want a media to be with us when we are going to start God's projects. So it is clear in chapter 2, verse 12 to 16, that Nehemiah was this kind of leader who was not waiting for approval from the world. He quietly did an inspection, assessment of the damage. And it was so bad, the situation was so bad, that the writer said in certain parts he had to step off from the horse or donkey and walk on feet. So there is no reconstruction at a personal level, at a family level, at a national level. There is no inspection that can happen without facing the damage before you want to build. And basically, if I were to come to South Africa, you can see that we started by celebrating. We did not take time to inspect the corpse of what we called apartheid. The church began to get taken up by what we call the new South Africa. But it was our duty to quietly do the inspection of the damage of the wall. So Nehemiah know the worst part before he could begin to work for God's best. It is also in this story later that I see that Nehemiah met and worked with Ezra, and he became, as I said, a leader who was not frightened of partnership. Invited Ezra. There's a portion where the whole book of the law was read, and it was read for days. And Nehemiah did not read himself because he knew that Ezra was more competent to do that job. So we should learn as Christians that although we may even be divided by what we call denominations, we should always respect each other's strength, and in moments of building, we should allow those who are strong in certain areas to lead in those areas for the sake of the work of God. Those are very important for me, Mkosi, and the panelists, things that we can learn. Maybe let me wrap it by saying, I come back to that part that said the gates were burnt by fire.
Yeah.
Ongena sango, kungenwa kuphunywa kuwo. So it's critical that we rebuild the gates. It could be gates of morality, gates of speech, gates of hearing, any gate. We are living in that kind of condition now where Mzansi is like city without gates. And gates were important in Israel, if I look at the book, and the gates were manned by elders.
Yeah.
Because a gate is a point of entrance and a point of exit. This is where I believe spiritual leaders need to be found. They need to be groomed, because you don't start by increasing the budget from Boweni. You start by finding spiritual leaders who are going to guard the gates, monitor the situation. That is the story for me for this afternoon.
Well, thank you so much, Bishop. And I must say that another characteristic which is very, very important when it comes to leadership, and that is the leadership style of delegating duties. And one of the points that I've picked up, from Bishop Mbete here, delegating leadership, a bold leadership, a self-sacrificing leadership, and a leadership of prayer. First and foremost, a leadership of prayer. And then a delegating leadership, a bold leadership, and all of these. And I would love the panel to expose these and look for applications. And I'm thrilled by the applications that Bishop Mbete is bringing out, particularly also the South African perspective. The Bible, written in Africa, has to find solutions for Africa. What's happening in Africa is not foreign from what's happening in Babylon, from what's happening with the children of Israel, from what's happening in Jerusalem. So I'm thrilled with the panel exposing the type of leadership that we see in Nehemiah, so we may reflect on what kind of leaders are we, or leaders that we elect to power to lead us. Pastor Xhamela, your network seems to be settling now, and I'd love to bring you in. Gazlam, before I go back to Bishop Maponga, I would love to bring you in. I'm sure you're chisek with the points on the leader, the great leader, Nehemiah. Over to you, Gazlam. Magaba, just take us through to your critical points about Nehemiah.
Okay. I apologize in advance if my network is going to give me a problem. These are new surroundings. I've just checked in. But back to what we are talking about, I'm not sure, because I came late, I'm not sure if my colleagues here were able to give a historical context of the book of Nehemiah. Because according to me, we can be dragged into the drama and everything around it, and lose the crack of the matter as to what is it, what is this building of the walls, what are these walls that we are talking about that needs to be rebuilt. To me, that's very much important. And Nehemiah's book is actually within the context of Ezra 4 verse 6. And I think I'm quite impressed with what Pastor Maponga, Bishop Maponga said earlier, where a decree was made by Artaxerxes that as a commandment to cease the rebuilding, because now I want to point one thing from the word go. The rebuilding of God's people will always be met with a threat to a fallen world, by a threat to a fallen world. Because if you remember, there was always a threat by surrounding nations. They did not want this rebuilding of Jerusalem, because if, I think is it when you start the book of Nehemiah, it is because they know the power that Israel had before. They are aware. It's not taking them by surprise. They know the power that Israel had. That's why they did not want for this rebuilding to take place. That's why I'm saying, when we transform our characters to become like Christ, this will always be met with a forceful opposition from a fallen world. It will always be met with an opposition. Okay, so that I want us to know that and recognize that. So after the enemies of God's children had successfully stopped the rebuilding of the temple, because you will remember, Patko, that this was not for the first time. During Ezra's time, it was oppression. Now, during Nehemiah's time, it is the return. Nehemiah would have heard rumors of a disaster and so on. Okay, so now Nehemiah is brought at a time when the church is afraid to complete the mission of God. Remember, the children of Israel are timid. They are afraid. They are discouraged. And Nehemiah is coming at that time. Okay. Now, my question now says, what does a leader do when you observe a nation of God that is simply would not take up their duty to fulfill God's purpose? What does a leader do? What does a leader do when the church is folding its arms and instead of being a salt to the earth, the church is afraid? What does a leader do? Okay, when the church is dragging its feet, failing to rebuild, when the church is timid, when the church is afraid, what does a leader do? So we see Nehemiah as a leader doing something. There are two ways that a leader can do. Now, I want to highlight the first and the foremost, because that's where we need to start. When you know, there are two ways that you can do. You can just be afraid. You can remain with the status quo. You can look at the situation. You know, you can put the church down. You can criticize the church. You can find fault as a leader. But what does Nehemiah do? That's what I want us to look at quickly. What does Nehemiah do? From the start of the book of Nehemiah, we see a leader who gets on his knees. Now, we can't jump that one. I see my colleagues here are already on chapter 2, which is fine. But the first and the foremost that Nehemiah is doing when things are like that, he is going down on his knees. You know, he is fasting and he is praying. You know, and we need leaders who fast and pray so that the will of God be done through this nation. Now, Nehemiah had a burden for God's people, and Nehemiah is petitioning God on behalf of his people. So he fasts and prays. And when we look about that, what excited me, my passion was, there's a format, there's a structure that Nehemiah is doing when he is fasting and praying. And there's something, there are Jews, there are you know, things that we can learn, object lesson on the structure. Nehemiah is not just praying for personal request, but there's a structure. When you look at chapter 1, verse 5, Nehemiah is saying, 1, God, you are great. God, you are great, acknowledging the greatness of God. And Nehemiah 1 verse 6 is saying confession of sin. I'm looking at that as a structure of his prayer. Confession of sin. After acknowledging the greatness of God, he is saying confessing the sins of his people and his sin as well. And number 3, in verse 8 and 9, Nehemiah is saying, remember your promises. So you can look at the structure. Nehemiah is saying, number 1, God, you are great. Number 2, confession of sins. And number 3, remember your promises. Now, to me, that structure is powerful. And the question that came into me was, now, as we are looking at the structure, where does the power in Nehemiah's prayer lies? Does it lie in the structure? Does it lie in how powerful Nehemiah prays? Is there a format that, if applied correctly, can move God to perform? You know, are the number of days, of fasting days that we are following as God's people, do those numbers causes God changes the God's arm? What is it? Is it the structure? Or what is the cause that God's will be done in the time of Nehemiah? Is it the structure of the prayer? No. I find what it says when I conclude. It is because the prayer, Nehemiah's prayer, was aligned with the will of God. It was aligned with the will of God. It has nothing to do with it has nothing to do with how powerful you are praying. James 5 verse 16 actually says, the fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. And Ellen G. White, when I close, Ellen G. White is saying, if your will is aligned with God's will, then your prayer becomes omnipotent. You become omnipotent. Now, there's only one person who is omnipotent whenever we talk about, it's God, the omnipotent God. But now this writer says, when our will aligns with God's will, then our prayer, we become omnipotent. We change, we transform, we restore. And this is what Jeremiah does. So before we go to...
I'm going to hold you there. You've just said something very profound. When our prayers are aligned to the will of God. May I also advise the panelists that the time now is 7 minutes to the hour of 3.
Yeah.
Viewers around the world, from Zambia, from South Africa, from Mauritius, from the UK, and all these people that are writing messages on the screen to me here are saying part 2 of this discussion is inevitable, because we've done some good work on introducing the leader, that is Nehemiah. We've probably not done justice to challenges he met and how he dealt with those challenges. We may take the next few minutes, for instance, doing exactly that. Bishop Maponga, I want to bring you in here, and Bishop Mbete, you will also help me. Who are these characters, Sanballat, Tobias, and all of these people? What do they do in the story? What can we learn from these kind of characters in the story? Because as Pastor Xhamela has said, we pray and we pray and we fast. And more often, by faith, our prayers are aligned to the will of God. But then we find internally that kukwaba chafisi, where that want to derail the entire process. Who are these Sanballats and Tobias? What do they do to the story, Bishop Maponga?
To align myself with the audience, actually, that could be a very good question to introduce the part 2. Since we only have 7 minutes left, I would want to maybe recapture what Bishop Mbete said and maybe put an outline that I was taking notes while he was talking. I like the point where, for today, just for the introduction, let's all agree on the value and the importance of assessing damages at all levels, personal, family, church, and nation. We need to look at the damage of colonialism. We need to look at the damage even of religion and Christianity itself. We need to look at the damage of the economic system. We need to look at the damage of the educational institution. We need to look at the damage which has been caused on the African child. Only after we've assessed the damage, stage 2, can that be that we begin, therefore, to read the books of the law. That talks to me of governance. What sort of governance are we going to be running on? Are we going to be running on Roman Dutch laws? Are we going to be running on Sharia care, which is Islam? Are we going to be running on the monotheistic, Judaistic kind of a principle? What are the laws that must govern the people? Only after reading the book of the law, assessing the damage, take note of the progression. Firstly, you build the gates and put the elders, custodians of points of entry, emotional entry, physical entry, political entry, travel and immigration entry, not only to our homes, not only to our communities, not only to our country, and not only to our continent. We're looking at the concept of doors right across the spectrum, and particularly for the ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, put a watchman on the doors that lead to your soul. That could get me somewhere else. You know, women are the official gates through which we come into this life. The question is, who are the elders who are standing next to your gates? After building the gates, repair and build the broken walls. Take note of that. It is building the gates, repairing the walls. Only after that can you begin to rebuild the temple. Because you cannot build the temple when you don't have the walls, when you don't have the gate. Why did they start with the gates? Because some parts of the wall were still standing. We should say to the Africans, it's not all lost. Some parts of ourselves are still standing. We need to bridge those parts which are broken and put the doors and the gates in place. Then we can talk about building a church. And building a sanctuary cannot be established without walls and without gates. Only after the temple has been built can we start building homes. Take note of that developmental context that we have. A home is not safe without a temple. A temple is not safe without walls. Walls are not safe without gates. Therefore, that progression on its own begins to insert to us, how do we build sustainable communities? We cannot be in a hurry to say, let's return tithes and offerings, when we don't have the walls in place, when we don't have the gates. And take note, the gates are the economic entrances to the cities of old. That's where business was happening. That's where fish was being sold. That's where transactions were taking place. Therefore, you cannot build a temple if you don't own the gates, if you don't have repaired walls. You cannot have homes if you don't have a standing temple. Therefore, the order for me becomes important. It is assess the damage. After assessing the damage, read the books of the law, identify correct governance structures. Then you can begin to put the gates in place, repair the walls, repair and build the temple. Then you can build homes and start producing children in a civilized society. I thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bishop Maponga. I want to bring in Bishop Mbete here. I know that we are pressed, and I want to respect the fact that I asked you for an hour. But if we agree, we certainly have to do justice by coming back next week. But we need to leave it at a particular point. This, which we may call part one, which is today, and I think we are now beginning to get into the crux of the matter. Okay, I like and appreciate Bishop Maponga, the contextual organization that you've been doing on the case that we cannot have a temple of God if the walls outside the temple are not taken care of. We cannot even have walls if the gates are not taken care of. And who manages and mends the gates? Who watches over the gates? He who watches over Israel then has to deploy somebody to watch over the gates. Let me bring in Bishop Mbete. We're going to be wrapping up for part one, but I want to bring you in, Koziwam, just to come in. It's beginning to get hot in here. Over to you.
Who were these? I want to say that these were not lightweights, Sanballat and Tobiah. For example, in chapter 4, verse 2, we see that Sanballat was more like a governor of Samaria, and he had an army. And he could summon Nehemiah as an equal in chapter 6 from verse 2. And according to chapter 13:8, which will come back next time, Sanballat, one of his daughters, was married to the son of the high priest. And you come to Tobiah, and he had strong ties with Jewish priestly families. So the moral lesson is that as you prepare to build, God allows enemies to be in, not to destroy you, but to make you stronger. That will be my point. They are not sent by the devil. They are part of divine grace to make, and the purpose is not to destroy, but to make you stronger. If you don't have enemies, you become weak.
Yeah.
Kuzawufiwa kulo part 2.
Look, you know, Maponga earlier on was speaking about what I would call the chronology of restoration.
Yes.
And part of that chronology of restoration means you must also have a template of getting a Nehemiah. Because look, it's one thing to know that we need to build the walls. It's one thing to know that we need to rebuild the temple. But the question is, how do we get a Nehemiah? You know, the Bible doesn't tell us who were failing Israel, because Israel, there were leaders in Israel at the time in Jerusalem, but obviously they had failed in their duties, hence the situation had so deteriorated. So God raises up Nehemiah to come into the picture in this situation. So as we look at our own restoration, whether as a black nation, as individuals, as a church, we must be able to say, this is how a Nehemiah looks like, because a lot of times the fall of the walls starts because we have decided to use our own thinking without looking at the right template to be able to give us a picture of the right Nehemiah. We elect people, and then later on we want to remove them, and yet we're the ones who said this is our Nehemiah. So we've got to know how to get a Nehemiah before even that process of rebuilding is. Because if you get the wrong Nehemiah, that wrong Nehemiah is not going to be able to follow the process of rebuilding. He's going to do his own thing. He has no vision for the larger mission. And so it becomes incumbent upon us also to be able to say, how do we get the right Nehemiah? And part of that mix of answering that question is to have a spiritual people who are influenced by the Lord to be able to see what others cannot see in order to get the right Nehemiah.
Well, next week when we're back, we probably will deal with that question. How do we see a wrong Nehemiah? How do we see a right Nehemiah? Right now in South Africa, some of us that are watching on this show make a mockery and joke about a chief justice that prays. They've never seen a chief justice that prays. And people make a mockery of Justice, Judge Mogoeng, when he prays. So next week we'll probably get deeper, because we need leadership that can pray, leadership that can mourn and weep and fast and pray. If we want to rebuild the walls of South Africa, so that's where we've got to begin. If we want to rebuild the walls, fortunately, ikhona i-template ebesiyibonile kwi-COVID. I-COVID ivale konke kwashiyeka kuthetha uThixo. I-COVID. I-COVID ivala i-soothsayers, yavala abathakathi, yavala othikoloshe, yavala amagwirha, yavala izangoma, yavala konke kwashiyeka kuthetha uThixo. And so let me just get 30 seconds of parting shot from all panelists, and then we're out of here. Then we're going to come back to part 2. Pastor Xhamela Mbui, am I getting your 30 seconds? Where are you? I don't see you. All right. Let me get 30 seconds of your parting shot. Pastor Bishop Maponga, your 30 seconds of your parting shot.
My 30 seconds will be spent that if we are meeting next week, then we suggest that everyone should, for this week, go through the book, and we can come back next week and enjoy some nuggets that we find in that text. But for now, I have pinned on the wall the strategy of rebuilding a nation, and the 6 points that I extrapolated from Pastor Jawu and Bishop Mbete and Xhamela. I think it can give you a guideline as you are going through your reading to be able to identify those factors and see how can you implement those in your own life. I thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Bishop Joshua Marara. Maponga Uhlati for that particular contextualization of the first part. Let me come to Bishop Mbete for your 30 seconds parting short up on program.
I think my point is that the word that I take away is, how do we discern a Nehemiah? Meaning, in leadership, there's what they call chair one, and some leaders are supposed to remain at chair two. But once a leader who's supposed to be in chair two wants to be in chair one, then trouble begins.
Yeah.
30 seconds parting short there from Bishop Mbete. Okay, and let me see if we have Fundisi boy Xhamela for her parting shot. Gazlam, I don't see you. I'd love to get your parting shot. In the meantime, Mashimane, Pastor Mapumulo, your 30 seconds parting shot.
Don't let your social location defeat your spiritual destiny. You know, nobody knew or counted Nehemiah in the solution that Israel had, but God raised up Nehemiah. And I'm saying, so sometimes you think your social location does not qualify you to be the leader that God needs to solve problems of society. And that should never be your thinking, be your mindset. Hence, I'm saying, don't let your social location defeat your spiritual destiny. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Just this message that I'm seeing from Usis Fundiswa Taboshe City, I'm Nandio Yiswa rebuilding, in other words, redoing something. It's difficult to build, then it's worse to rebuild. Wow, it would be nice then that the panel takes this as umpak or to sort of assist her with that. But I think in Pastor Mapumulo's closing remarks, he has mentioned something. Don't undermine your position socially and think that you may not be an answer to what God is looking for in terms of rebuilding. You know, Pastor Mapumulo, that was quite profound. A point I tetileyo. We all have to be back then next week, same place, same time, and I'm putting my panelists on the spot now to say, Bishop Mbete, we're going to need you next week. Bishop Maponga, we're going to need you next week. Let's come back. Let's come back, you know, and see how far we take it next week. Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you in the panel. Bishop Mbete, siyabulela bel. Hlati, siyabulela. Bishop Marara Maponga and Mashimane, siyabulela kakhulu umfundisi Mapumulo, umfundisi Xhamela ebese qhawukile. We'll see you next week. Thank you so much. 2 p.m. next week. And here we meet again. God bless you. Take care. And remember, it could be you, just you, even in your social deployment, even in your professional deployment, even in your political deployment, you could be a Nehemiah. God bless you.